was actually born in South Africa, in Bloemfontein, where quite by chance his father was working for a bank. But the family came from Birmingham, and when the father died young, the mother set up a home just outside Birmingham at Sarehole Mill. And this was glorious, idyllic countryside with a water mill, with sort of blackberry dells, copses and so on. And Tolkien and his brother roamed there for 3 or 4 years and had such a wonderful time that it's quite clearly reflected in the opening chapters of The Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien describes the idyllic, happy rural life of the hobbits in the Shire. So he had that, and that was a fundamental experience to him. Then the mother decided that she must move the children into Birmingham in reach of good schools, and he hated this move into this big smoky city. I mean, it really was when industrial pollution was at its height, you know, the factory chimneys belching out. That he hated, though in a way I feel he loved it, because I think you can see this reflected in his descriptions of Mordor. It was also in Birmingham that he met his wife. He was at this time orphaned and living in a lodging house in Edgbaston run by a rather witch-like lady, or so he said. And also living in this house was Edith Bratt, whom he eventually married. He fought in the First World War in the trenches as a signalling officer, and in a way that made no impression on him. It was a kind of experience so awful on the Somme battlefield that he shut it out from the rest of his mind. It comes in at moments in the stories, in The Lord of the Rings, where the heroes are undergoing various awful experiences. But really what it did was drive him more and more into himself and make him more determined to cultivate his own private landscape. And so he withdrew really from the war, and it was at that point he began to write his books. After the war, he became a university teacher, first really at Leeds and then back at Oxford. The main point about his Oxford career was that it gave him a lovely cosy nest really to inhabit. His teaching duties weren't that heavy. He had a big house in North Oxford in which his 4 children grew up. He had marvellous friends in C.S. Lewis and other dons of like mind, all of them really strongly religious, all of them liking fairy stories and myths, and they would meet together in Oxford pubs for pints of beer and in Lewis's rooms in college on Thursday nights. You know, and drink their beer and smoke their pipes and talk good manly talk and read their stories to each other. That was really wonderful. That's what was the best part of his life and really gave him the encouragement to go on writing.
The first memories I had of him was when I was a very embarrassed undergraduate, and he was a rather famous don. And he used to, because he knew I'd been the original reader, invite me to tea and hand me slices of manuscript, which I now know were slices of The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, out of context, and say, read this, dear boy, and bring it back next week when you come to tea and tell me what you think about it.
Then I think there was an enormous shock, both when it came out and when it proved to be so successful. A lot of Tolkien's colleagues, I think, were irritated by it. They felt that Tolkien had been sitting, apparently to their doing nothing all these years, and then turned out he hadn't been doing nothing. He'd written a great big book. It was enormously successful. Everybody was reading it. You'd think they'd be pleased, but actually they weren't.
He didn't like fame, and he didn't like all the palaver at all. He never actually really ever appreciated that he'd become famous, always wealthy. He always worried about his finances.
He and his wife found their Oxford house too large to manage. They moved to Bournemouth, and they found a nice little sort of Hobbit-like bungalow in a particular wooded corner, where, you know, he again worked in the garage. He really cultivated discomfort. It was extraordinary. That lasted a couple of years. His wife died while they were there. He came back to Oxford and had a very happy couple of years living in bachelor rooms provided for him by Merton College, where he'd been professor of English language and literature. The last years was spent in trying to finish the Silmarillion. Actually, he never wanted to finish, this is quite clear. He never wanted to finish. I think he never wanted to publish it. It had been the necessary background to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. He didn't feel that seen close up to by readers, it would have the same excitement as it certainly doesn't, despite very skillful editing by Christopher Tolkien. Also, of course, he still wanted to have the thing to live with. He didn't want to finish. He never wanted to finish. He wanted to die, still inhabiting and working on this extraordinary world of his, and that's what happened. He died in the end, you know, quite peacefully of an ulcer, it seems, while on holiday for a weekend in Bournemouth.
Hi, I'm Tim Hildebrandt, And I'm Greg Hildebrand.
We were doing a lot of children's books in those days, golden books, Doubleday books, and you can sort of see in that picture a children's book look to it, I think anyway.
Yeah, I think the whole first calendar
Had
we
that
were
kinda
kind
look
of
to it.
thinking of it in terms of more
Kitty,
of a children's
book rather
not
than
kiddie, not
No,
little,
no,
but somehow children's bookish, more. You
yeah,
know,
right.
and that's
Even though it's got scary stuff in that first calendar, but so did a lot of children's things from the past. Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs with the evil queen.
And compositionally, it becomes like falling back on the whole grid idea that, you know, the Greek thing, which is what we divided off into those things. Well, primary center of, you know, it's like Gandalf's got to be on the right talking this way. I mean, it's just, I don't
Because
know.
your eye comes in from the left to the right.
Then back to him again,
Then
back
back
to Bilbo, sitting there talking, blowing that
And
smoke
that
ring.
whole fence put in there leads right up to Gandalf.
Right.
Just
Points right
there's
towards
no
him.
mistake in that. You've got to look at him first.
Right.
That
It
tree,
leads to him.
that tree behind him, that comes back into the scene, pointing at him.
A lot of round circles, round
Kinda-
sunflowers, round wind.
Kind of like the Teletubbies, you know. What the Prancing Pony? Well, you gotta want it a low angle here. Talk about angle and storytelling.
Hobbit's eye view.
Hobbit's eye view
To see this big guy, you know?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's totally you. That's the whole,
Because when you
from
first-
their point of view.
From their point of view, when you first saw him downstairs in the inn, he's huddled by himself back in
Strider.
the corner. Yeah, Strider, crouched at that table. He could be a scary character, even up to this point. You know, they're not quite knowing who this guy is, right? And so you try to create something ominous with that twisted hand up on the shadow up on
The low
ceiling.
light.
The low light.
That low light thing, casting the shadow up against the ceiling,
Right.
gives it that scary quality, which is again coming back from all the old movies, you know, going back to Frankenstein and
Yep.
everything.
All
I mean,
that
all that
stuff.
stuff's in there for us.
Right.
But I think, you know, you try to. The other thing is not like the composition and but angle, point of view is part of storytelling.
Yeah.
You know, that's part of the storytelling. Where you set your horizon line, if you're looking down or you're looking up or you know.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's just like where you're looking at it from, where you're looking at the scene from.
And again, there's that placement of the center of interest, him, with that beam going right into his head, you know.
Strider.
And that sword hanging down, you know, just keep going around and around and around.
Mm-hmm.
That lamp hanging down, leading you back in again.
And again, that costume on him is coming out of our
The Robin Hood era.
old movies. It's kind of like coming out of that stuff. And all the N.C. Wyeth books that we used to have, you know, and read as a kid, you know, all the stuff that he illustrated. It's all kind of like being
Right.
influenced by that stuff.
Yeah. When I start designing a composition like that, I just start doodling. And it's stream of consciousness, it really is. I just start doodling shapes. The pencil doesn't stop.
There's no logic.
There's no logic.
That you're applying.
I'm trying to come up with interesting shapes and, you know, and
Shapes that-
form stuff also that we did as kids from the past, like the shape of that building. That see the arms stretching out from it. We built that as one of our early sets in the barn, not in the garage. It was a planet set of a huge set of a planet. You're on the surface of a planet, and we built the thing out of plaster with these big
It had that
wings
kind
sticking
of
out.
shape to it,
Had that
yeah.
kind of shape to it.
The lighting on this is just a gray overcast.
Oh, yeah. Cool light, which that is, coming right overhead, down, and the darker it gets, the warmer the shadows are. Actually,
Yeah.
It's burnt umber in the shadows.
Mm-hmm.
It's cobalt blue or ultramarine blue and white for the highlight coming down.
See, there's that children's booky type stuff in
Yeah,
here
with the
again,
face on the
with
building.
the faces and the rock and then the buildings.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of like,
Yep.
which is not in the book, right?
No,
It's sort of like
it's not. Tolkien doesn't say
It's,
anything
you know.
like that. She's still, to me, that picture there shows a children's book.
it has a
look
quality
to it.
Yeah, a younger look.
Because the orcs are a little less ugly here.
Setting it up like that. The first thought I think was to put that orc from the back, right?
Totally.
Right? You get this big,
Dark
huge,
object blocking the fire, yeah.
big looming
Yeah.
thing there.
Ominous thing looming over the tiny hobbits.
It's circular too.
Yeah,
It's a circle. You know, the thing goes around in a circle.
right.
The way that the sword leads in, goes
Yep,
in, and
yeah.
the spear. The armor there, we started mixing it Roman and Persian. You know, with it's just like, and it's and Japanese samurai stuff. I mean, we just started throwing it together. More, I don't think just to have fun with it, just to kind of mix up a whole bunch of stuff and have
The
it be
best
a
of
lot
all those cultures, yeah. The
Yeah.
scariest looking stuff of those cultures.
I think because I had a photograph of a guy posing as a Roman soldier with this cardboard Roman soldier helmet that I made, that is why the orcs end up kind of looking like that.
Yeah.
Because I happen to have this old photograph. Those are guys, I always like those guys. I had fun with the orcs. They're neat, you know?
Absolutely. That
Contains
comes out of a lifelong hang up on, I think, Disney's animation, the multiplane camera.
Everything is contained.
Remember the multiplane camera shots like in Bambi in the forest? There would be about 5 levels of art, and each of those would be moved by at a different speed going into it to give you the illusion of movement. That's what is my influence is
Right,
on
and it also
coming up
forms
with
a
that.
whole containing kind of like. But again, it's a compositional issue too. That bam, and the Steris is right there, smack to the right.
Well, the road leads right to it.
Yeah. And again, there's dark against light. It's all that dark against light stuff that we're always dealing with. That forms it and wraps it like.
And by the way, we use plastic horses for models on these. Anything time a horse ends up, and you can't ever go out and shoot a real horse in that pose, in that lighting. You never get it. You're never gonna get it. But I see that as a moving camera shot in the movie myself, right there. This tree's you know, not a fast movement, but you're kind of moving through like that as the things go by you.
But that's what's going through our heads as we paint these things too.
Yeah.
Is that you're seeing that movement? You know, you're imagining it. You're putting yourself in it.
Yep.
Again, I think, you know, see, he's very children's booky.
Very, that whole scene.
That whole scene is like
all the mushrooms
coming out of that influence for us. It almost got the setup though is almost like an altar, with, you know, it's altar with candles on either side of it. It almost has a kind of a
We could have that.
religious thing about it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
For what reason, I don't know, but
He's the high priest, you know.
yeah. You know, how do you make evil tower look different than a good tower? You try to make it, you know, on here, it's these kind of claw-like things coming out with a central spike coming out of it.
Yeah, what makes that evil?
I don't know.
That's a good thing. You know what I mean? When you analyze it.
Well, take a
why
look.
does that look evil?
Well, look,
And-
for good angels, they put feathers on them. For bad angels or devils, they got bat wings.
Yeah, is that evil?
Yeah, I know it. But
It's a weird perception. Yeah, it's an accepted perception.
Perception,
or
yeah.
prejudice, or whatever you
Whatever you
want
want to call it, yeah. And we got a sulfur bomb. You put it in the middle of the floor, light it, and run. And we stood there and watched it. Thick fumes of sulfur coming up, hit the ceiling and go out in
spread
these
out in
concentric rings.
So
Like
because hey, that's Mount Doom.
That's Mount Doom. That's where that
It's
idea
like
came
totally
from.
like, you know, to get that ringing out, like the dark cloud is moving off all over mortar. It's probably the most significant and important thing I've ever illustrated in my life, that's for sure. The most memorable, what? I guess the one I'll be known for. That's what I'll be known for.
The Hobbit has become one of the most successful children's books of all time, if not the most successful children's book. Millions and millions of copies have been printed, and it's gone into dozens of languages all around the world. And it's very satisfying and heartwarming to note that the genesis for this book actually lay in Tolkien's relationship with his own children. Every Christmas he used to write his children a letter which he managed to convince them came from Father Christmas at the North Pole. And it was this tradition of writing for his own children that led directly to the creation of The Hobbit.
He began to write for his children, really, when the first of them, the eldest of them, John, was a small boy. What he did was to make up a letter from Father Christmas each Christmas and leave it in the fireplace. And these letters are full of Father Christmas telling the children what's happened at the North Pole the last Christmas and so on. They stretch from 1921 till the mid-1940s. And they get better and better, and they're very entertaining and beautifully illustrated, and he's actually, in a sense, trying out his wings for writing for children in The Hobbit.
The Father Christmas letters began when I was about 3. They were very exciting because they always arrived, sometimes only on Christmas morning, but sometimes they came with the ordinary post. And when they came late, they inevitably left awful muddy, snowy footmarks all over the floor when the Father Christmas had come down the chimney with the letter and left it. They were a very important part of Christmas for all of us.
It was a very gradual transformation from absolute total belief into a realization that it must be my father who did it all. But such a pleasure in keeping the process going that one believed and yet knew and what the truth was. And certainly my brothers never in any way spoiled it for me. They entered into this absolutely, although they knew so much longer than I did that my father was Father Christmas.
What do you think the poor dear old bear has been and done this time? Nothing as bad as letting off all the lights. Only fell from top to bottom of the main stairs on Thursday. We were beginning to get the first lot of parcels down out of the storerooms and into the hall. Polar Bear would insist on taking an enormous pile on his head, as well as lots in his arms. Bang, rumble, clatter, crash. Awful moanings and growlings.
He was very, very conscious of being a West Midland writer, almost unnaturally so. He was very proud of his mother's family, the Suffields, who came from Worcestershire. He was actually born in South Africa, in Bloemfontein, where quite by chance his father was working for a bank. But the family came from Birmingham, and when the father died young, the mother set up a home just outside Birmingham at Sarhill Mill. And this was glorious, idyllic countryside with a water mill, with sort of blackberry dells, copses and so on. And Tolkien and his brother roamed there for 3 or 4 years and had such a wonderful time that it's quite clearly reflected in the opening chapters of The Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien describes the idyllic, happy rural life of the hobbits in the Shire.
I think that was a kind of double coming home, which made the effect of the ordinary English meadows, countryside, and breaks so immensely important to me.
Under eastern silver sky, where the bright moon light, in a land of bright bird song.
We're here in the heart of rural Warwickshire, and this is the kind of landscape that Tolkien would have grown up in the early days when he was living in Sarhill Mill. Nowadays it's part of the outskirts of Birmingham, so you have to come slightly further out to discover this kind of landscape. But you can see all around me where the inspiration for a place like the Shire might have come from, and the pattern for those comfortable, warm hobbit holes that we hear so much about. If you come to Warwickshire, you can begin to understand some of the influences that were at work on Tolkien.
quite by accident, The Hobbit tumbled out of him because he had children and it originated as a story really for them. The story of the Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, who goes off and challenges the dragon, the little tiny hero against the giant.
The actual beginning, though it's not really the beginning, but the actual flashpoint was, I remember very clearly. I can still see the corner in my house in 20 Northmoor Road where it happened. I got an enormous pile of exam papers there, and marking school examinations in the summertime is an enormous, very laborious, and unfortunately also boring. And I remember picking up a paper and actually finding. I nearly gave an extra mark for it, extra 5 marks, actually. There was one page on this particular paper was left blank. Glorious. Nothing to read, so I scribbled on it, I can't think why. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. I think that was eventually published in 1937.
As regards the writing style of The Hobbit, it's very straightforward. There are no great linguistic devices. But for a first work, Tolkien did an excellent job of tailoring his language perfectly for the audience. He doesn't talk down to them or patronise them as he was concerned to do himself. And probably the reason for that is that he had his own children. So he was aware just how the language of the book needed to be pitched, and he comes to that perfectly in The Hobbit.
Gollum lived on a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He was watching Bilbo now from the distance with his pale eyes like telescopes. Bilbo could not see him, but he was wondering a lot about Bilbo, for he could see that he was no goblin at all. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island while Bilbo was sitting on the brink, altogether flummoxed and at the end of his way in his wits. Suddenly up came Gollum and whispered and hissed, "Bless us and splash us, my precious. I guess it's a choice feast. At least a tasty morsel it'll make us Gollum." And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat. That is how he got his name, though he always called himself my precious. The Hobbit jumped nearly out of his skin when the hiss came in his ears, and he suddenly saw the pale eyes sticking out at him. "Who are you?" he said, thrusting his dagger in front of him. "What is he, my precious?" whispered Gollum, who always spoke to himself, through never having anyone else to speak to.
He used to tell stories every night, and often I went to sleep with hearing him telling fairy stories. I can't actually remember him telling the stories which were later incorporated into The Lord of the Rings. I think my older brothers do remember this, being that much older.
How it began, I would think, in 1926-27, when we first went to Oxford, and was told us at Christmas time, in chapters, which is why it has chapters of adventures. If we were lucky, we got a couple of extra chapters each Christmas, and the other ones had to be repeated, so it got longer and longer and longer.
As we know, Tolkien taught philology at Oxford, which is the study of how languages evolve over time.
It's very difficult to explain to anybody who hasn't, as I have, suffered the Oxford University English Language and Literature course exactly what philology is about. It's a science that was invented by a group of Germans during the 19th century. Largely it's been said by certain people in order to befuddle the world outside, and it is a very, very dense subject to those who don't know. It's now out of fashion, is in fact now a dead subject. It's really being taken over entirely by linguistics and by different forms of language science. But basically all it is the historical study of languages. It's really quite simple. It means that you look at a language not as it stands at the moment, but you look at its history, you see how the forms of words have developed, and in doing so you're liable to come across quite a lot of interesting history. Tolkien learnt that. In fact, he did partly teach himself. He began reading it while he was still at school, and this is fairly remarkable. He then went on to study it at Oxford.
But with The Hobbit being a book for children, there isn't a great deal of literary overtones. Nonetheless, we can see quite a number of influences because Tolkien loved the surviving fragments of literature from the Dark Ages. He was also not just a teacher of, but a passionate devotee of the Icelandic Eddas and the Norse sagas. And it was from them that Tolkien gained a lot of his inspiration. In The Hobbit, we don't see a terribly large amount of this, but there's enough there in the society of the dwarfs to see that clearly they have been modelled on the Norse society.
He didn't even finish it. He got it to a point where anybody could have finished it. Any writer of any competence, he got it to the point where the dragon has been killed and, you know, the dwarves are about to get back their treasure, but there's going to be a big battle. The story from then on merely requires a few tying up of ends, and really, as I say, anybody could have completed it. He didn't bother. He put it in a drawer and it stayed there. I don't think it wasn't that he hadn't got confidence in it, just that he'd lost interest in it at that point, and he wasn't, as I say, writing for anybody else. He'd already told the story to his children. It was finished, therefore, as far as he was concerned. And it was only quite by accident that a publisher discovered its existence and it got into print.
Well, my father, who was the publisher, believed, and I think rightly, that children were the best judges of children's books. And so when I was a 10-year-old, he used to bring home children's book manuscripts, and I was paid 1 shilling for my report. I had to make a written report, and one of those manuscripts was The Hobbit.
Report on The Hobbit. Bilbo Baggins was a hobbit who lived in his hobbit hole and never went for adventures. At last, Gandalf the wizard and his dwarves persuaded him to go.
Luckily for me and for everybody else, I wrote an approving report.
And should appeal to all children between the ages of 5 and 9.
Got paid my shilling, which was probably the best shilling this firm's ever spent, and the book was published.
Not only have you had a marvellous adventure story and a marvellous fantasy, but some of the magic has rubbed off on the ordinary, very homely things of life, like a good meal.
Like food, there's a great joy in food.
Food? Never been a trencherman. I admire trenchermen, therefore I make... But I like, I must say, since England produces the best basic food in Europe, on the whole, it does.
And drink, the fact that there are pubs in Middle-earth.
Yes, yes, I drink things. I like, of course, feeling elevated, but I'm very fond of beer.
And stuff like tobacco.
I've always smoked. I sometimes smoke beyond the point when you enjoy it, which is silly, but I do smoke and enjoy it, and as a matter of fact, it's now so tied to writing that I can't write without it.
All these are sort of homely, pleasant things, and it's the sort of basis of things homely in the Shire.
The Hobbits, I think, are Tolkien's image of people from the West Midlands at the start of this century, only shrunk. And the reason they're shrunk, I think, is that they're living in the world of the heroes. So they're like us. If we were living in a world of heroes, we wouldn't be able to run around throwing our weight about. We would have to manage as best we could. So the Hobbits have to manage as best they can by perseverance and determination and humour and their endemic inability to take things really seriously. So there is, as it were, a set of reader figures running through this heroic or epic landscape and just about surviving in it, just about managing. And that, I think, gives you something to identify with, set against a background which is entirely different and which offers a kind of glamour which has vanished from the world.
It's not just the physical world that Tolkien modelled on Warwickshire. These are rural people, and he looked around and he saw the kinds of rustic characters that there were at the turn of the century around these fields, and he built his Hobbit world very much based upon them. They're the ordinary people of Warwickshire shrunk down in size, so that when we suddenly go out into this big heroic world, we associate very much with the small people.
Then the mother decided that she must move the children into Birmingham in reach of good schools, and he hated this move into this big smoky city. I mean, it really was when industrial pollution was at its height, you know, the factory chimneys belching out. That he hated, though in a way I feel he loved it, because I think you can see this reflected in his descriptions of Mordor, the country which is the seat of evil incarnate in The Lord of the Rings, where you have this wonderful description of the smoking, fiery mountain, Mount Doom, which is the centre of it, and an impression of vast factory-like caves and so on, where orcs, goblins, you know, work at build their armaments and so on. This is quite clearly reflects something of Birmingham in the early 1900s.
One of the things that Tolkien detested above all else is modernity. He hated the modern world. He hated to see the end of what he considered to be the older English way of life, and how that connection with nature was quickly being swept aside by the forces that had begun at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and obviously in the 20th century had begun to really build pace.
It was also in Birmingham that he met his wife. He was by this time orphaned and living in a lodging house in Edgbaston run by a rather witch-like lady, or so he said. And also living in this house was Edith Bratt, whom he eventually married. He fought in the First World War in the trenches as a signalling officer, and in a way that made no impression on him. It was a kind of experience so awful on the Somme battlefield that he shut it out from the rest of his mind. It comes in at moments in the stories, in The Lord of the Rings, where the heroes are undergoing various awful experiences. But really what it did was drive him more and more into himself and make him more determined to cultivate his own private landscape. And so he withdrew really from the war, and it was at that point he began to write his books. After the war, he became a university teacher, first really at Leeds and then back at Oxford. He wasn't, in some senses, a good teacher at all. His actual performance in the lecture room was largely incomprehensible to many people. My mother used to say that she was an undergraduate in the 30s at Oxford, say that if you sat in the front row you could hear him, but only in the front row, but then of course he spat all over you because his teeth didn't fit very well. Anywhere further back it was quite inaudible.
Tolkien was one of these small group of writers from Oxford, each of whom created a very special and immortal fantasy land. First, of course, there was Lewis Carroll, who created Wonderland, where Alice had her adventures. This was followed by Tolkien himself, who created his Middle-earth. And finally, very hot on his heels, came C.S. Lewis with his Narnia adventures.
The main point about his Oxford career was that it gave him a lovely cosy nest, really, to inhabit. His teaching duties weren't that heavy. He had a big house in North Oxford in which his 4 children grew up. He had marvellous friends in C.S. Lewis and other dons of like mind, all of them strongly religious, all of them liking fairy stories and myths, and they would meet together in Oxford pubs for pints of beer, and in Lewis's rooms in college on Thursday nights. And drink their beer and smoke their pipes and talk good manly talk and read their stories to each other. That was really wonderful. That's what was the best part of his life and really gave him the encouragement to go on writing.
I was, on the whole, a rather puny, over-mothered, timid little creature who was not much of a success. I eventually became a fairly ordinary scholar. Turned out to be good at rugby football, of all odd things.
I think there was no doubt about his ability, his intelligence, or the effect he'd had. There was also a strong feeling that he had rather given up the trade, that he didn't publish very much in the learned way after about 1940, 1941. He was still working on things, but not very fast. So I think there was, to begin with, a kind of puzzlement as to what he was doing with his time, and he had a reputation for laziness. This was quite wrong. I think he was, an obsessive worker, but nobody saw the work being done. He was sitting at home writing his books and writing draft after draft after draft and trying to make it absolutely perfect. But he didn't tell everybody, or indeed many people at all, what he was doing.
Having achieved such a major success with The Hobbit, Tolkien now turned his attention to the next real challenge, and that was to take the world of Middle-earth and extend the boundaries and write a comparable saga, but for an adult audience.
I now wanted to try my hand at writing a really stupendously long narrative, and to see whether I had sufficient art, cunning, or material to make a really long narrative which would hold the average reader right through. The best, one of the best forms for a long narrative is as was found in The Hobbit, though there's a much more elaborate form, of the pilgrimage on journey with an object. So that was inevitably the form I adopted.
The first memories I had of him was when I was a very embarrassed undergraduate, and he was a rather famous Don. And he used to, because he knew I'd been the original reader, invite me to tea and hand me slices of manuscript, which I now know were slices of The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, out of context, and say, read this, dear boy, and bring it back next week when you come to tea and tell me what you think about it. That was a terrible challenge. I knew that I liked it. I didn't know what was going on and who was doing what to whom. But I came back next week and I said, well, that was very interesting.
Then I think there was an enormous shock, both when it came out and when it proved to be so successful. A lot of Tolkien's colleagues, I think, were irritated by it. They felt that Tolkien had been sitting, apparently to their eye, doing nothing all these years, and then turned out he hadn't been doing nothing. He'd written a great big book. It was enormously successful. Everybody was reading it. You'd think they'd be pleased, but actually they weren't. I think there was a feeling of jealousy, even a feeling of anger. One comment which somebody passed on to me that was that when a colleague, and indeed a friend of Tolkien's, was told what he'd been doing and the book was out, he looked at it and he said, he should have been teaching.
There have been 26 translations into other languages of The Hobbit and 20 of The Lord of the Rings. But I would say that he is both popular and unpopular across the board, because there are those who deeply dislike The Lord of the Rings and all it stands for. There are those who are passionately addicted to it. And I think it is because it always rouses strong opinions that you get this extreme of expression and of like and of dislike.
No, I don't at all like Tolkien or what he stands for. It seems to me that his work implies an escape from political and social reality. Now, this seems to me reprehensible. It's an implication of triviality, it's an implication of regression, a refusal to face up to our political and social problems, our religious problems of today. And the cult of The Hobbit, the cult of Tolkien in America particularly, seems to be responding to this sort of failure in engagement with our political and social situation.
Here was the Oxford professor who was supposed to be writing monumental works on Anglo-Saxon poetry, who was in fact sitting up all night writing fairy stories. This was how most of them felt. It's how many of them still feel about him. There was also jealousy, quite obviously, of the fact he'd made a lot of money out of it. And he did, I think, regret the fact that his colleagues weren't able to be a little bit more liberal and open-minded about this and to actually praise him.
There was a feeling that he'd outflanked everybody. After all, for many years, for many decades, I think, people had got used, especially on the literary side, to patronising philologists and saying, well, it's an interesting subject, I suppose, but it's all very passé, it's fuddy-duddy, it's not relevant, nobody takes any notice of it. Suddenly, bang, you write a smash hit bestseller, you sell, you know, umpteen million copies, you become enormously rich. Well, you know, it means that your predictions about them have been quite wrong, and there's a sense in which some of his colleagues thought they'd been made a fool of.
It's a pity it couldn't be in the springtime when that tree wouldn't look sad, but covered with leaves, you see. Look old, but not sad. And these, that, looks like kind of plain, doesn't it, sometimes? Whatever that tree is, and these are limes. But all the limes have such a, however old they are, they're lovely green in spring. I have always, for some reason, I don't know why, been enormously attracted by trees. All my work is full of trees. I suppose I have actually, in some simple-minded form of longing, actually would like to. I should have liked to be able to make contact with a tree and find out what it feels about things. And the old Ent says a few things, doesn't it, about feeling the sap run up and the open to the sun. I haven't the slightest recollection whatsoever. I normally preserve a very bright visual recollection of where I was, where I am, and things that are associated with what I'm looking at. I haven't the slightest recollection of anything. Either the position, where the window was, myself, or the thoughts, anything out of the whole of the Ent chapter. That came straight out of the leaf mode. There was no difficulty, there was no sense of trouble of composition. It must have been sort of burgeoning there.
Then with a crash came a great ringing shout. Ra, Ra. The trees quivered and bent as if a gust had struck them. There was another pause, and a marching music began like solemn drums. And above the rolling beats and booms of the swell voices singing high and strong. Tarun, narun, 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 tahora, kumba, kumba, noon. The Ents were coming. And ever nearer, louder rose their song. Tahura hara lamba noon, da lamba tara munda roon, da munda ram, da runda ram, da munda lamba munda tom. Then Brigilad picked up the hobbits and strode from his house. To Isengard, the Ents cried in many voices, to Isengard. To Isengard, though Isengard be ringed and barred with doors of stone, though Isengard be strong and hard and cold as stone and bare as bone, we go, we go, we go to war, to hew the stone and break the door. For bowl and bow are burning now, the furnace roars, we go to war. To land of gloom with tramp of doom, with roll of drum, we come, we come. To Isengard with doom we come, with doom we come, with doom we come.
There is, of course, the cynic's view, which is that Tolkien essentially wrote the same book twice. If we look at the similarities between the plot, there is the strong possibility that he may be guilty of that charge. Both books start with the arrival of Gandalf after a long absence into the Shire. He brings news that precipitates a journey. In The Hobbit, they encounter the trolls. And of course, by the time of the Lord of the Rings, the adventures are much, much more sinister. But essentially, it's the same idea. Both parties then arrive at Rivendell, where counsel is taken. And they both then move on to discover a new city. In The Hobbit, they discover Esgaroth by the lake. And in The Lord of the Rings, they eventually find themselves in Minas Tirith. The eagles are used in both books to rescue Gandalf from difficult situations. And you can have a great deal of fun spotting the similarities between the two plots of the two books.
He was deeply moved and grateful for the fact that so many people responded with great appreciation to the book. And although it was a heroic task, I think he greatly appreciated being able to reply to or to be in contact with so many people who wrote to him.
The letters were enormous, but instead of the postman, a van used to arrive each morning with the morning's post, which he couldn't get through the door. And in the beginning, my father tried to answer them all.
It used to come in at a phenomenal rate towards the end of his life. It ranged from the purely lunatic to the highly informed critical analyses. He was also sent curious presents, mushrooms which went bad in the post, and tobacco, and clay models of this or that, which bamboozled him completely. He didn't know really what to make of it all. So in the end, we took more and more of this onto ourselves on his behalf, and I think he was quite relieved.
There were all kinds of horrors sprung on him in the years when the book was being successful, The Lord of the Rings. My favourite was the American film company which turned up in Oxford wanting to film The Lord of the Rings, and they'd written the most wonderful storyline or scenario for it, in which all the kind of delicate things of the original story had been Hollywoodified. Interestingly, a character who in Tolkien's story is called Boromir was called by the American film writers Barrymore, you know, shades of Ethel Barrymore. The elves sustain themselves and fellow travellers on long journeys by something called lembas, or whey bread, which is a really rather kind of holy thing. It's a bit like communion wafers, actually, in the Christian church. It's got that kind of overtone. The Americans described this as a food concentrate. There were worse things to come after his death. The Lord of the Rings has been filmed, I think, fairly execrably by an American. And there was a horrible film of The Hobbit on American television, and various other nasties like that. Fortunately, he didn't live to see those. They've, of course, twisted his own conception quite out of recognition. The thing has been Disneyfied or worse. There have also, of course, been all kinds of toys and such like. Most of that happened since his lifetime. There was nothing quite so awful in his lifetime.
I think one looks on them with modified rapture. Tolkien himself disliked them on the whole. He came to fame very late, and I think he was worried by what was a dilution or an adaptation of a vision that he had seen very clearly all through his life. And he didn't like people tampering with his vision.
No, you can go back west. No, you west, you go back west. Deep bog. Oh, weird. Oh well, should we do it again?
The first editions of the Hobbit carried some wonderful colour plates which depicted the world of Middle-earth as Tolkien himself envisaged it. And it's often overlooked just how good an artist Tolkien actually was, because he was able not only to describe this world, but to visualise it as well in some very, very satisfactory watercolours. Now, if we look at that, what we actually see is Tolkien's view of Middle-earth contrasts sharply with many of the other artists. It's much more a medieval kind of environment. His plates have a lot of the naivety and the feel of medieval manuscripts, and that to an extent was the world that Tolkien loved in literature, and it was also, these clues provide us with, the kind of world that he envisaged his hobbits occupying.
He was essentially a Victorian, and Victorians had skills in the arts of either in doing amateur music or in doing amateur art. I had a grandmother who was a watercolourist. She wasn't a great watercolourist, but she did it as a lady's occupation. And in a sense, Tolkien had picked up this Victorian habit of practicing an art. And he practiced watercolour and pastels very effectively.
And there are lots of paintings by him of his landscapes which have been published since his death. They're really, again, they're not done as works of art. They're done simply to help him visualise the landscape he's writing about. They're a kind of aid to him as a writer.
When I was about 16, I think, that's the first time I was introduced to the book. It had a great effect on me. I think that was when I first started to sort of get really interested in painting the series. I mean, obviously, it's my interpretation. I wouldn't force onto anybody else and say, well, this is it and this is how it's supposed to be. You know, this is purely my interpretation. If somebody likes it as much, then that's fine. I try not to go into too much detail. I try to get the same enjoyment out of painting them as I did when I actually read it. And the problem is when you sort of get further into the book itself and you start reading into details, then you can become too critical, I think. So I try and keep it as free as possible.
I happen to be painting on a little scene of this little dwarf skipping over a bridge towards this maple tree, all gnarly and everything, a lot of detail. And a girl that worked in the office came in and looked at it and said, that reminds me of the Hobbit. I said, what's a Hobbit? So the next day she brought in the book, gave it to me, loaned it to me, went right through it in about a day, was hooked instantly, read all three of the Lord of the Rings books, and I was hooked instantly. I wanted to illustrate that in some way, but how it was going to come out, I have no idea. I never thought of doing a calendar until my wife, Rita, got me a Tolkien calendar from a 1965 J.R. Tolkien calendar of his illustrations, the watercolors that he used to do. And on the back of the calendar was this little box that was an invitation an invite to artists to submit their work to Ballantine Books, who was the publisher, and got the job to do. And that was it next year, and it was an instant worldwide hit.
Hobbits. Oh, well, you meet them, you know. There's hobbits by nature and hobbits by stature, and there's hobbits who happen to be both, yeah.
He's the most unusual man I've ever come across who read books. I mean, authors are a notoriously unusual breed, but really he's not like any other figure in English literature. Very, very isolated in every sense. He was isolated socially. He moved in a small circle of Oxford dons, but not outside at all. He, I think, read very, very little in modern English writing. Not that much in English literature. In fact, since Chaucer, he used to say, you know, English literature stopped at Chaucer. But there was something genuinely sad about him. One can't study his life without coming away feeling that there was a kind of deep unhappiness which motivated the books, which gives them their wonderful sort of longing for a past age. And the whole point of his stories is that they're about nostalgia, they're about looking back to a golden age that's gone. And by being stranded, as it were, in the 20th century, in modern industrial society, and feeling completely out of place in it, he was able to create this writing.
Yes, well, he was a really absent-minded professor, and at the post office in High Street, the old lady there was rather a dragon, but he won her over by posting his false teeth through the screen and putting his envelope in his mouth. Similarly, the bank used to keep all the things he left there. I once went with him to the bank, and they opened the drawer and gave him back his last 2 or 3 pipes and gloves and things.
He was very, very conservative. Daily Telegraph reader, you know, had supported Franco in the Spanish Civil War. Very, very right-wing, very unattractive, therefore, to many modern readers of his books. Actually, this wasn't really fascism. He wasn't really deeply right-wing. He was merely somebody who had been born into a world where those were the accepted values, and he never really rejected them. He was a very deep, profound Catholic, Roman Catholic, and this comes out in his books. Now, The Lord of the Rings is not a religious book in that it's not about God and the angels and so on, but in fact it's a very religious book in tone, and he knew this while writing it. It's really, it's a book which tries to convey the feeling of religion to a world which is not actually a believing world and a non-religious world. This, I think, is largely why it's been so popular in America, in what is on the whole a kind of godless modern world. It particularly appeals because it's bringing religion back into fiction.
I don't live in America. Surely they should tell me. I should like to ask them some questions of how such things arise. I observe in general that North America has always been much more easily kindled than England, or indeed any country in Europe. And for instance, the Dickens cult and the extraordinary excitement about Dickens. So the only people who came down to the quay to watch the mail ship coming, the only thing they wanted to know is what happened to the next chapter. They weren't worried about goods.
I think that Tolkien was the greatest English philologist this century, and that his trade as a philologist had a very great deal to do, if not everything to do, with the creative work which he finally produced.
I first began seriously to invent languages about when I was 13 or 14. I've never stopped, really.
He said, and I believe him, that he wrote The Lord of the Rings because he wanted to construct a world in which Elen Sila Lumen Omentielmo would be a normal greeting. So he worked out the language, he worked out the way they would say hello, and then, of course, you had to work out a story to explain how this phrase, "May a star shine on the hour of our meeting," would actually be normal.
Languages have a flavour to me, which I never understand people saying, for instance, it was awfully dry and dull, because a new language to me is just like taking a new wine or a new sweetmeat or something. What I'm doing now is to try and write in Elvish, because my writing is very inferior to the Elv. Their standard greeting when meeting: a star shines upon our meeting. Oh, Lord. I made a mistake, didn't I? And that stands for Ellen, Sila, Lumen, Aumenti Elvo.
He was creating a history, a myth, a mythology for England, he called it. And that involved not just a story, it involved geography, cartography, geology, ethnography, any other ography you like. He had to do it all, and he did.
In fact, by inventing languages of his own, Tolkien was merely saying, yes, all this kind of history of languages thing, it's a great game, it's fun, it may have limitations, but you know, I can play it too, and was simply creating his own linguistic world which he could play about with.
I wouldn't mind other people knowing it and enjoying it, but I didn't really want to, like some people who've been equally inventive in language have done, sort of make cults and have people all speaking it together. No, I don't desire to go and have afternoons talking Elvish to chaps. One thing, of course, Elvish is too complicated. I've never finished making it.
Tolkien had a great passion for maps. He loved to draw maps of his Middle-earth. And unlike many other fantasy worlds, Tolkien's world was almost completely realised in all of its dimensions. He even created a whole geological history for his Middle-earth that involved continents colliding together over ages and splitting apart. So it was a very, very complete world. It had its own languages, its own culture, its own belief systems, its own mythology, and it was a place, really, where he liked to escape to, and since then, millions more have gone on to do the same.
He used to draw enormous charts and maps of not just the landscape, but also things like the phases of the moon, the weather, perhaps even the tides, things that he was certain he had got to get right because he was writing a real story about a real world, so it seemed to him. And everything must work on its own terms, must fit, or the thing wasn't going to be real to him.
Fame came too late. It worried him rather than pleased him.
Well, I think that he found certain aspects of the success, particularly the cult aspects and the extreme amount of publicity, very difficult, particularly as he was getting older by this time. He was frightened of the intrusions on his privacy.
He didn't like fame, and he didn't like all the palaver at all. He never actually really ever appreciated that he'd become famous, always wealthy. He always worried about his finances and that he hadn't got much money and he was overspending.
It was kind of penny pinching that in the days when film rights had been sold for a vast sum and money was pouring in and so on, you find him keeping an account in his diary, 2 3 and 6 matches, tuppence halfpenny. Old habits didn't die.
He didn't mind the fact that for the first time in his life, probably in his 70s or thereabouts, he was adequately rewarded for his pains. But what he did with his rewards was very modest. He didn't drive, so he sometimes took a taxi. That was just about all he did by way of luxury.
He was very pleased to have his books widely read, that goes without saying, and what author isn't. At the same time, he was quick to be sensitive at all the kind of negative aspects. He hated the invasion of privacy, which sometimes happened. I mean, he and his wife would be having breakfast in their little house in Oxford, and cameras would poke through the hedge. American tourists would ring the bell and want to photograph Professor Tolkien.
He had a way with them. There was the one who rang from London and arrived with his secretaries and 3 coloured umbrellas. And my father had an alarm clock which he kept in a drawer. And if there were people he really didn't want to see at that stage, the alarm clock was set for a quarter of an hour after they arrived. And when the alarm clock went off, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I've got another engagement." That invariably got rid of them. They went quickly. People found his telephone number and used to ring up in the middle of the night. One I remember especially, because I was at home, was the one who rang up from Ohio and wanted him to find her son, who was hiking in Europe with a copy of The Hobbit in her pocket.
Tolkien's inspiration simply was language, and he wanted to create a world where people spoke the languages that he'd invented. He set himself a certain imaginative pattern in his adolescence, which consisted chiefly of his absorption in Anglo-Saxon and Middle English and other early Germanic languages, and that led him eventually to writing The Lord of the Rings. He wasn't, you see, though, setting out to write a great book himself. This is a very important point. What he was setting out to do was to create a kind of something private in the back garden or in the loft. It's a hobby much more like model railways than writing.
He was constantly writing, then putting aside or rewriting and storing it away. In fact, more has been published by Tolkien since his death than was published in his lifetime, because so much was, in fact, unfinished business, put away in box files.
The last years was spent in trying to finish the Silmarillion, the big work of mythology, of which The Lord of the Rings is just a sequel. He went on and on at it. In fact, he never got anywhere near finishing. What he would do would not be simply to continue writing the story. He'd, in a sense, done all that years before. But he was always trying new versions of old bits, or was trying to rewrite older versions of newer bits or something, by which I mean that it got terribly complicated textually. Actually, he never wanted to finish. This is quite clear. He never wanted to finish. I think he never wanted to publish it. It had been the necessary background to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. He didn't feel that seen close up to by readers, it would have the same excitement as it certainly doesn't, despite very skillful editing by Christopher Tolkien. Also, of course, he still wanted to have the thing to live with. He didn't want to finish. He never wanted to finish. He wanted to die, still inhabiting and working on this extraordinary world of his, and that's what happened. He died in the end, you know, quite peacefully of an ulcer, it seems, while on holiday for a weekend in Bournemouth.
The good storytellers always last. His place in literature is, I'm perfectly sure, secure. I don't think we understand what that place exactly is, because he doesn't conform to the norms or the criteria of fiction as we understand it today. But he is writing heroic romance, and as such, he is, I think, secure in his place in fame.
I suppose the easy thing to say is that The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit could become eccentric classics like Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, one-offs. And it might be like that. But I think there is a possibility also, depending on which way the future goes, which one can't tell, that Tolkien will be felt to be typical, a representative of something which, like Middle-earth, was dying with him. That he was, you know, the last of the old Western men who were brought up before the First World War and before things changed, but who lived on well into the 20th century and who wrote a book about what it was like to live through these disastrous years, in some ways, of war and defeat and what looked like failure, but who never really himself gave up hope that there would be a light beyond the darkness and that things would get better.
And before the sun had fallen far from the noon, out of the east there came a great eagle flying, and he bore tidings beyond hope from the lords of the west, crying, "Sing now, ye people of the Tower of Anor, for the realm of Sauron is ended forever, and the dark tower is thrown down. Sing and rejoice, ye people of the Tower of God, for your watch hath not been in vain, and the black gate is broken, and your king hath passed through, and he is victorious. Sing and be glad, all ye children of the west, for your king shall come again, and he shall dwell among you all the days of your life. And the tree that was withered shall be renewed, and he shall plant it in the high places, and the city shall be blessed. Sing, all ye people." And the people sang in all the ways of the city.
There were always mistakes all along the line. If you read his letters to his publishers, everything goes wrong. I mean, blocks are misplaced for illustrations, and this isn't right and that isn't right. And it's a nice irony that at the very end, his third name, Rule, should be misspelt Revel on his tombstone.